In a previous video, I talked about some of the things Jordan Peterson gets wrong about Nietzsche. In this video, I wanted to talk about some of the things that he got right. If you've been watching Jordan Peterson for a while, then you might have seen a video titled 45 Minutes on a Single Paragraph of Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil on his channel. What I'm going to do is play this video and give some additional context to the things Jordan Peterson is talking about. In this video, Jordan Peterson is reading from Beyond Good and Evil, Chapter 1, Section 6. I'll give a little context before we see what Peterson has to say. In this section of Beyond Good and Evil, which Peterson is reading from, Nietzsche challenges the age-old idea that philosophy is a dispassionate quest for knowledge and that philosophers are genuinely seeking the ultimate truth. Philosophers have traditionally seen themselves as unbiased seekers, driven by reason and detached from personal interests in their intellectual pursuits. Their sole concern was believed to be the pursuit of truth. Some philosophers, in fact, felt it was crucial to shield themselves from their emotions and sensory perceptions, as these were considered potential distortions of reality, or at best, obstacles to clear reasoning.
You generally think that when you're thinking about, as I mentioned before, the structure of the objective world, but Nietzsche is making an entirely different point here, and what he's fundamentally doing is treating the philosopher not as a rational being, but as a living being. And there's a big difference between being a rational being and being a living being. Because if you're a living being, your primary goal is to do whatever it is that furthers your life. And if you're a rational being, then your primary goal is to do whatever it is that a rational being might do. And you could say that a living being should first and foremost be a rational being. And in some sense, that's the message of the Western Enlightenment. But it's by no means self-evident that that's the case. And it's certainly not something that Nietzsche doesn't believe that people are rational beings.
According to Nietzsche, every philosophy should be seen as a manifestation of a specific physiological condition. Rather than being an unbiased search for truth, philosophy often turns out to be an expression of particular psychological desires and physiological conditions, cleverly masked as rational, objective, and moral. Given that a particular philosophical viewpoint always arises from the individual's bodily condition, it can be seen as a form of autobiography. Through their philosophy, philosophers inadvertently unveil their true selves and the nature of their being. Gradually, it has become clear to me what every great philosophy so far has been, namely the personal confession of its author and a kind of involuntary and unconscious memoir.
So his claim fundamentally is that no matter what the philosopher thinks he's doing while he's writing philosophy, what he's actually doing is revealing and articulating his being. And then you might say, well, where did that being come from? And the answer to that is, well, partly you could consider it a biological function insofar as that we have value structures that are built into us that are the process, we would say, the process of a very long evolutionary history. But because you're also a cultural phenomena, and because the manner in which you've arranged your values and your desires has been conditioned to the last degree by the process of enculturation that you were subjected to, when you confess in an autobiographical manner and articulate that, what you're also doing is recapitulating the entire structure of your culture.
Nietzsche believed that we are the product of a long moral and spiritual development, and that this past continues to live on within us. In a section from Nietzsche's book Human, All Too Human, he writes, "The past continues to flow within us in 100 different waves. We ourselves are indeed nothing but that which at every moment we experience of this continued flowing."
You act out a pattern of behavior, and that pattern of behavior is like a dance that someone is manifesting to a symphonic score. It's unbelievably complicated, and it has its psychological elements, and some of those are conscious and some of them aren't. Some of them are just implicit and embedded in the way you act and the way you perceive, and what the philosopher is attempting to do is to reveal those to himself and to articulate them so that the entire structure can be analyzed. Well, so Nietzsche's first proposition is that when a philosopher is thinking, that what he's doing is not thinking, It's revealing himself in an autobiographical sense under the guise of rational thinking. And so then it becomes something more like a story.
We've come to believe that our conscious thoughts exist independently of our instincts, unaffected by them. However, Nietzsche's philosophy takes a different view. It sees every aspect of culture as a symptom of a unique way of life and instinctual organization, essentially reflecting the body that gives rise to it. To put it simply, what we create is a product of our individuality. Since thought is intimately linked to the body, a philosopher's philosophical activity cannot be divorced from their individuality and idiosyncrasies. It's a byproduct of the instincts that govern that person. Nietzsche declares in Beyond Good and Evil that even in the case of philosophical thought, conscious thought and instinctual activity are not separate. After having looked long enough between the philosopher's lines and fingers, I say to myself, by far the greater part of conscious thinking must still be included among instinctive activities, and that goes even for philosophical thinking. To grasp the idea that our conscious thought is intertwined with instinctive behavior, we must first understand Nietzsche's understanding of the origin of consciousness and language. Nietzsche posited that the development of consciousness and language was significantly shaped by the herd instinct. Words serve as the vessel through which thought attains consciousness, and both elements fulfill collective roles. An individual, being relatively vulnerable on their own, is compelled to communicate with others to enhance their chances of survival. To convey their needs within a group, they require consciousness in words, but prior to that, they must understand their own feelings and thoughts. In essence, this implies that consciousness is not an exclusive aspect of an individual's life, as Schopenhauer believed. Instead, it emerged within a social context, rooted in the instincts that govern social organization. Since conscious thinking initially emerged from these instincts, then conscious thoughts, including those that appear rational and objective, should be attributed to instinctual activity. If the majority of conscious thought is indeed instinctual, it logically follows that we lack complete control over it. Being conscious is not in any decisive sense the opposite of what is instinctive. Most of the conscious thinking of a philosopher is secretly guided and forced into certain channels by his instincts. Philosophy doesn't just engage the intellect on an abstract level, it's exclusively intertwined with the body. In his work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche describes the body as a great reason, and the intellect as a small reason. This passage puts forward the idea that the intellect isn't detached from the body's instinctive drives. Instead, it serves a larger unity that's already rational. Nietzsche views the body as intelligent due to its self-organizing processes, self-guidance, behaviors, decisions, and actions. By breaking down the intellect into the subconscious forces that shape it, Nietzsche ascribes rationality to these underlying processes. In simpler terms, rationality isn't a feature of a distinct and separate intellect, our small reason, but rather a trait of the body as a whole. Consequently, when a philosopher articulates a specific set of ideas, they inadvertently reveal themselves, whether they recognize it or not. A belief system essentially becomes the personal confession of its creator. Nietzsche said that every philosopher is aiming at some moral with his life, and he tries to articulate this in his philosophy. So if we wish to understand a philosophy, we have to figure out what this morality is. The moral or immoral intentions in every philosophy constituted the real germ of life from which the whole plant had grown. Indeed, if one would explain how the abstrusest metaphysical claims of a philosopher really came about, it is always well and wise to ask first, at what morality does all this? Does he aim?
What Nietzsche is alluding to there, in some sense, is that the philosopher can't help, and that would be, in some sense, also the person who's recounting their autobiography, can't help but tell you what they're up to, even though they might not know.
What the philosopher is essentially doing is expressing the conditions that promote or safeguard their own existence. This is precisely what moralities aim to achieve. They reflect the viewpoints of various individuals and underline the circumstances required for their well-being and success. For instance, Christianity, with its emphasis on universal love, compassion, pity, altruism, and selflessness is rooted in the herd instinct. This becomes evident when you consider that Christian morality places significant importance on the welfare of others and guides how one should behave within a community. Being considered a good person largely hinges on your actions toward others. Christians are encouraged to serve others, especially the unfortunate. Therefore, Nietzsche believes it represents the perspective of the herd, or if you prefer, the gregarious instinct. The specific beliefs and values that we embody essentially spring from the type of person we are, and they aim to foster and safeguard the kind of being that we are. Even behind all logic and its autocratic posturings stand valuations, or, stated more clearly, physiological requirements for the preservation of a certain type of life. To understand what needs are hidden beneath a particular philosophy, and additionally what instincts were expressed within it, we have to examine the conditions of life that were expressed in that philosophy rather than focusing on logical consistency or truthfulness. The moral or immoral purposes of every philosophy constitutes the real germ of life from which the whole philosophical system has grown, as Nietzsche says in the quote from earlier. As an example, most of Western philosophies have expressed, among other things, the ascetic ideal. Ascetic ideals are values that advocate for abstinence from bodily desires and impulses and involve withdrawing from the world. Many philosophers have regarded the senses and emotions as impediments to reason, and they should be suppressed or disregarded for the sake of objectivity. The philosopher's propensity for detached rational thinking means he is still paying homage to the ascetic ideal. In modern philosophy, we see a propensity for abstraction and technical language, which has made philosophy very far removed from everyday living. Even though the philosopher today may not try to repress his impulses, such withdrawal into abstraction is a kind of intellectual asceticism. If philosophy has been influenced by the ascetic ideal, Nietzsche contends that it has been guided by the instinct of decadence, thereby embodying a form of illness. In Nietzsche's view, the act of withdrawing from the world and suppressing one's emotions to foster detached rational thinking is, in essence, a pathological state. So, as Jordan Peterson pointed out, a philosopher inevitably unveils their true self in their writings, and this is an inevitable process. Consequently, it becomes imperative for us to closely scrutinize a philosopher's words, as they will inadvertently reveal their innermost nature while articulating their philosophy. There is a point in every philosophy when the philosopher's conviction appears on the stage. You can see from this that Nietzsche was skeptical of the claim that a genuine impulse to knowledge is behind a philosophical text. There are very different impulses or drives that are compelling a philosopher to recount his autobiography in this manner. I do not believe that a drive to knowledge is the father of philosophy, but rather that another drive has, here as elsewhere, employed understanding and misunderstanding as a mere instrument.
So one of the claims, I suppose this would be an Enlightenment claim, is that people do have a drive to knowledge, and that drive is in fact what underlies the production of such things as philosophy. But Nietzsche questions that because he's trying to bring us back to consideration of the fact that you can't separate the philosopher's mind from the philosopher's being. He's first and foremost a living creature, and he's up to something. And the question is, what is it that he's up to?
Nietzsche conceptualized drives as processes of unconscious thinking, feeling, and willing. Throughout his writings, he employs various metaphors to describe these drives, such as underwills, undersouls, or wills to power. Nietzsche's choice to use the term soul when referring to these drives carries a particular purpose. By characterizing the drives as souls, Nietzsche accentuates their inherent intelligence and subjectivity. These are not mere mechanistic forces. Instead, they are genuine living entities.
Here's how he's conceptualizing a human being. So the first thing he talks about is that there are fundamental impulses in human beings. Okay, so that begs the question is, well, what do you mean by impulse? And what do you mean by fundamental? And both of those are extraordinarily complicated problems. So an impulse, you can think of an impulse as a drive, You could think about it as a biological instinct. You could think about it as an aim or a goal. You could think about it as an act of will. Like there's endless questions that hang off that question. Well, Nietzsche certainly conceptualizes the human being as a place where those things live. And he does mean live too, because he wouldn't refer to them as demons or genies without introducing the metaphorical conception of something that lives. And so partly what Nietzsche reveals in those sentences is that he conceptualizes a human being as the dwelling place of spirits.
Peterson is heading in the right direction when he suggests that Nietzsche envisions the human being as a dwelling place for these drives. However, he's not quite hitting the mark. In another passage from Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche states, "The body is a social structure composed of many souls." These drives represent living entities organized into a hierarchical structure, and this isn't merely a metaphor. Nietzsche's conceptualization portrays the drives as not only shaping a cognitive structure, but also forming the physical structure of the body itself. By depicting the drives in this hierarchical manner and linking the psychological and physical realms, Nietzsche is forging a close connection between the two. It's essential to note that this doesn't mean he adheres to the typical materialistic viewpoint. Even though the drives exist in the material world, they are not mechanical forces or lifeless matter. Nietzsche is subtly implying that there may be more to matter than we currently comprehend. In essence, the human being is not just a dwelling place for these drives. Rather, these drives constitute a human being. In other words, the human being isn't something in addition to these drives. Since the drives constitute a cognitive framework, they play a crucial role in directing our actions and shaping our perception of the world. These drives essentially serve as interpretive mechanisms, projecting meaning onto the world and molding our personalities, ultimately defining our lives. Nietzsche views the drives as unconscious processes that assess things based on whether they further or impede the fulfillment of the needs inherent to each drive. In essence, these drives operate with specific goals in mind. Each drive is the drive to something good, as seen from a certain standpoint. There's valuation in it. Given that our perception and value judgments arise from the autonomous and unconscious processes of the drives, it logically follows that there is no inherent meaninglessness or impersonality in our actions or judgments. Instead, these actions and judgments inherently reflect the structure of the living beings that form our being. In the philosopher, conversely, there is nothing whatever that is impersonal, and above all, his morality bears decided and decisive witness to who he is. That is, in what order of rank the innermost drives of his nature stand in relation to each other. The value system of an individual, and even that of a culture, is a reflection of the underlying instincts and drives of some of the members of that society. Nietzsche intricately ties valuations to perception, emphasizing that values are essential for our understanding of the world, as they always represent particular viewpoints. Without values, there are no perspectives to be found. The drives, acting as interpretive and evaluative cognitive structures, produce their own goals as they interpret the world around us. Anyone who considers the basic drives of man to see to what extent they may have been at play just here as inspiring spirits, or demons and kobolds, will find that all of them have done philosophy at some time, and that every single one of them would like only too well to represent just itself as the ultimate purpose of existence and the legitimate master of all the other drives. For every drive wants to be master, and it attempts to philosophize in that spirit. Peterson had a really interesting analogy for the drives. In typical Peterson fashion, he uses a mythological analogy for the drives.
You're full of demons and genies, and they're all doing their own thing, whatever that happens to be. But each of them, if left to their own devices, would attempt to remake the entire world in their form. And so I've thought of this from a narrative point of view, or from a symbolic point of view. In old stories, in folk tales and fairy tales, you often have Cyclops. They're one-eyed giants. And there's a sexual connotation to that, which is apropos that the psychoanalysts would certainly point out. But the one-eye idea is that this thing is gigantic and wants one thing. And so that's another way that Nietzsche is conceptualizing the fundamental structure of the human psyche. It's a dwelling place full of one-eyed giants, and they're constantly, well, one way of looking at it is they're constantly at war. One of them wants to be the largest one-eyed giant and dominate everything else. And then one of the things that, so Nietzsche takes that argument further and he says, not only is this always happening in human beings, but that if you look at philosophy, what it is it's a continual revelation of the attempt of some singular-minded psychic monster, psychological monster, to dominate the entire psychological structure, and therefore the entire cultural structure, and therefore the entire world.
In a note from Nietzsche's notebooks he wrote, "It is our needs which interpret the world, our drives and therefore and against. Every drive is a kind of lust for domination. Each has its perspective, which it would like to impose as a norm on all the other drives." In this quote, Nietzsche argues that every drive inherently seeks to impose its perspective and dominate the overall structure. Essentially, this is what defines a drive as a will to power. Peterson discusses the development of monotheistic value systems as part of the civilizational process, and in doing so, he appears to be endorsing monotheistic belief systems, with Christianity being the obvious elephant in the room. Nietzsche acknowledges that a culture's system of values is, to some extent, a reflection of the drive structure within at least some individuals of that culture. However, Nietzsche also warns against the dangers of allowing a single drive to exert absolute dominance over the entire structure. For instance, if the instinct of self-preservation were to reign supreme, life's progress would stagnate, as we would neglect other pursuits essential for growth. The fundamental principle of evolution wouldn't function if the instinct of self-preservation dominated in all living organisms. Therefore, Nietzsche contends that it's preferable for a set of drives to share dominance within the structure, creating an impulse aristocracy, rather than a single drive ruling supreme. One misconception arising from the concept that a drive represents a will to power and a pursuit of dominance is that it may seem as though Nietzsche is reducing the fundamental motivation of human beings to a mere desire for power. And indeed, this is the interpretation that has been accepted by some people. Jordan Peterson offers an important perspective on this matter.
You can see the earliest manifestations in a paragraph like this of what later developed into deconstructionist thought. And that was mostly French continental philosophers who pursued that particular line of reasoning. And it is derived exactly from this kind of statement by Nietzsche. So, for example, someone like Derrida would say, it doesn't matter what the content of a text is. What matters is that the text can be used as a tool for power. And that whether the person who wrote the text knew it or not, that's what they were doing. And they were doing it in a way to privilege themselves above other people. And that's really, I would say, the fundamental deconstructionist claim. And it's a powerful claim. It's an utterly corrupt claim. But it's a really powerful claim, and it's related directly to the sorts of things that Nietzsche was referring to in this paragraph. What is it that the person's truly up to? Now, the problem with the deconstructionist claim is that it's an open invitation to cynicism, to thoughtless cynicism. I can just make the presupposition that whatever it is that you're telling me, you're telling me merely to dominate, regardless of what it is that you claim to be doing. Well, the problem with that approach is that it's predicated on the implicit assumption that the only value that people actually have is the desire to dominate. And of course that's a purely, that could be the case, and I also think that it's even reasonable to posit that to some degree that it is the case. But to take that from a contributing factor and to make that the highest God, because that's essentially what the deconstructionists are doing, those are entirely different things.
Nietzsche suggests that each drive harbors a desire for mastery, and it engages in a form of philosophical thinking with this goal in mind. However, it's important to clarify that this doesn't mean every individual solely craves power. While power may be one of their desires, the motivations of people are more complex than that, as Peterson pointed out. What's happening is that something within a person is expressing itself, striving to shape the world according to its vision. As a result, a person becomes an instrument for various wills to power, each with its distinct goals. Nietzsche, as Peterson has pointed out, is redefining the concept of power. Indeed, for a drive or impulse to be effective within the intricate interplay of other autonomous impulses, it must possess a form of will to power. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able to assert itself effectively. When you have multiple impulses, conflicts naturally arise within one's life, and the stronger one tends to prevail. Nietzsche frames these drives within a Darwinian context, involving both competition and cooperation. It's helpful to envision them as individuals in a society where individuals cooperate and compete, driven by their distinct wills, which can inevitably clash. Nietzsche defines power in psychological terms as the affect of command. Within this framework, our drives are arranged into structures, and a select few drives assert dominance within this structure. Given that each drive embodies an autonomous will, it's through the affect of command that any bodily or psychological function can be executed. This is because before any action can take place, there needs to be a prior establishment of organization and cooperation. Essentially, a hierarchy is formed each time we engage in any activity. This is how Nietzsche describes the process of willing. Within this framework, certain drives hold higher positions in the hierarchy and issue commands in the form of the affect of command. These commands are then obeyed by the drives occupying lower positions in the hierarchy. In essence, whenever we will an action, there's a division within us. One part issues commands, and another part complies with them. In all willing, it is absolutely a question of commanding and obeying on the basis of a social structure composed of many souls. It's not that we are controlled solely by the drive for power, but rather power in the form of the affect of command is the essential attribute enabling our entire organism to function. As Peterson has rightly highlighted, it would be a mistake to elevate the desire for power to the status of the supreme God, as there are various other desires at play. It's crucial to distinguish between being motivated by power and being propelled by a multitude of diverse wills to power.
That's sort of Nietzsche's idea of will to power in its nascent form. Like all of these unconscious entities that inhabit the human psyche are all alive, and they're trying to live, they're trying to climb up the dominance hierarchy and dominate, because of course that's partly what life does, because let's say from an evolutionary perspective.
This is why Nietzsche characterizes philosophy as the tyrannical drive. In essence, a philosophy always represents an interpretation of the world from the vantage point of a particular drive, or a collection of drives that aspire to mold the world according to their own likeness. You can think of them as one-eyed giants. They perceive the world solely through their own perspective and assert it as the sole legitimate viewpoint. These philosophical perspectives possess only one eye, a unique lens through which they view the world, often dismissing the viewpoints of others. Nietzsche provides a pertinent example of this in his analysis of Stoicism. The Stoics interpreted their moral doctrine as a natural principle, as if it naturally emerged from the laws of nature. While you pretend rapturously to read the canon of your law in nature, you want something opposite, you strange actors and self-deceivers. Your pride wants to impose your morality, your ideal, on nature and incorporate them in her. You demand that she should be nature according to the Stoa, and you would like all existence to exist only after your own image, as an immense eternal glorification and generalization of Stoicism. Nietzsche views this inclination as a form of injustice. He argues that every act of valuation inherently carries an element of injustice because it necessitates the exclusion of alternative perspectives and involves an imposition of judgment on those deemed undesirable. Our ability to exist hinges on our capacity to project and enforce our values onto the world that surrounds us. Without this act of projection, life can appear perilous, antagonistic, and even devoid of meaning. This is why Nietzsche thinks that living inherently entails a form of injustice. This is an ancient, eternal story. What formerly happened with the Stoics still happens today too, as soon as any philosophy begins to believe in itself. It always creates the world in its own image. It cannot do otherwise. Philosophy is the tyrannical drive itself, the most spiritual will to power, to the creation of the world, to the causa prima. If philosophies have indeed served as manifestations of a philosopher's prevailing instincts and drives, this challenges their truth value. One error Jordan Peterson made in this video we are discussing is his attribution of a pragmatist perspective on truth to Nietzsche. The pragmatists argue that truth is determined by what serves our practical interests. Here's what Peterson said.
One of Nietzsche's most famous maxims is that truth serves life. And that's a very different idea than the purpose of truth, say, is the accurate representation of the objective world.
The issue of truth presents a complex problem within Nietzsche's philosophy, and I won't go too deeply into it here. However, I will point out that asserting that what we've historically labeled as truths, such as religions and mythologies, were essentially beneficial errors that served our interests, and then treating this idea as a truth may not actually be a contradiction, although some may see it that way. The clarity depends on the level of analysis employed. You can make statements about truth that are genuinely true, what we might refer to as meta-truths. The confusion arises because some people struggle to consider multiple levels of a problem simultaneously. When you elevate your analysis and pose the question of the purpose of truth, you gain a higher perspective from which to comprehend truth and its historical utility. Thus, asserting that truth has served our interests and treating this as a truth involves adopting a higher perspective that aids our understanding of truth. In this view, there is no contradiction. In fact, this very argument actually dissociates truth from utility. So when Nietzsche contends that the justification of all philosophical systems should be based on their usefulness, he isn't attempting to define truth solely in these terms. Instead, by unveiling the unconscious instinct concealed beneath the mask of truth, Nietzsche believes he has exposed the true purpose of philosophy. What was at stake in all philosophizing hitherto was not at all truth, but rather something else. Let us say health, future, growth, power, life. Since it is health that is at stake and not truth, then the falsity of an argument is not an objection to it. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche proposes a new method of evaluating all philosophical ideas instead of focusing merely on truth. The question is to what extent it is life-promoting, life-preserving, species-preserving, perhaps even species-cultivating. It's important to point out that Nietzsche did think that a genuine pursuit of knowledge was possible. However, it is commonly the case that even with these scholars, there are other motives such as status or economic interests that could be driving them just as much as a genuine impulse to knowledge. Nietzsche held the belief that our practical interests outweigh the pursuit of objective truth. In fact, he argued that truth, when singularly pursued, can be detrimental and even perilous. Throughout human history, the relentless quest for ultimate truth has led to the destruction of many previously cherished beliefs and values. Nietzsche believed that we must, to some extent, distort or falsify the world in order to find meaning and sustenance in it. This aligns with our earlier discussion about philosophies shaping the world to fit their own image. It might be the only way we can coexist with the world. Continuing to relentlessly pursue ultimate truth may ultimately leave us with nothing to hold on to. The very aspects that provided our lives with meaning and purpose would all be sacrificed on the altar of truth, potentially rendering existence and our lives devoid of purpose and significance. Because of this, Nietzsche thinks the will to truth poses a significant danger. Will to truth, that could be a hidden will to death. I think I'll end this video here. We have covered a lot in this video already. If you want to learn a little more about some of the topics discussed in this video, you can check out my other videos on Nietzsche's philosophy. I hope this helped you to understand Nietzsche's philosophy a little better. Thanks for watching.